The audio file arrived at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. No name, no return number, just a voice. Calm, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar with the inside of a federal building. 14 seconds. That was all it took. They didn't lose those files, the voice said. They buried them deliberately, and the order didn't come from inside DOJ. Crockett listened to that recording 3 times before dawn. A source, someone with direct knowledge, someone claiming that evidence from Jeffrey Epstein's client list, names, records, and materials recovered from the Manhattan search, had been deliberately suppressed, not misplaced, not delayed by legal process, buried on purpose by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Pull everything on Manhattan, she said. We're going in differently tomorrow. But here's what almost no one in that room knew yet. The folder Crockett carried wasn't just about what was found in that Manhattan residence. It was about what was found and then quietly made to disappear. And the gap between those two things, that gap was about to become the worst 40 minutes of Pam Bondi's professional life. Journalists who normally covered budget markups had found seats. Staffers assigned elsewhere had quietly rerouted their mornings. Word had spread the way it always does in Washington, not through announcements, but through the particular silence of people who know something is coming. Attorney General Pam Bondi entered at exactly 9:08 a.m. 27 years of legal experience, confirmed by the Senate, a woman who had survived confirmation battles, hostile press cycles, and sustained criticism over the pace of Epstein file releases. She moved with the practiced composure of someone who genuinely believed she was prepared for this room. But Crockett had listened to that recording 3 times, and what she had heard wasn't a rumour. It was a roadmap. The first 40 minutes proceeded exactly as Bondi's team had scripted. Budget allocations, staffing metrics, coordination with federal partners. Bondi answered with ease, fluent and untroubled. The kind of composure that comes from thorough preparation and complete confidence in your preparation. Then her name was called. Attorney General Bondi, she began, her voice carrying a calm. The room immediately recognised as something different from the morning's tone. I want to start with a simple question about the 2019 search of Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan residence. The FBI conducted that search, correct? That is correct, Congresswoman. And among the materials recovered, the FBI catalogued items as potentially relevant to identifying individuals within Epstein's network of associates, including, according to reporting at the time, photographic materials and records found inside a secured safe on the premises. Bondi's posture did not change, but 2 members of her legal team exchanged a glance lasting less than a second. I'd want to be precise about what materials are covered by existing legal protections, before I'm not asking you to characterize specific items, Crockett said, her tone never rising. I'm asking whether investigators believed those materials were relevant to identifying associates. Yes or no? That would be consistent with the purpose of the search. Yes. Good. Crockett opened the folder, not theatrically, the way someone opens a document they have already read many times. Then I need to ask you about the Epstein client list because, Attorney General, you confirmed publicly earlier this year that such a list exists within FBI holdings. Director Patel confirmed the same. And yet the individuals named on that list have faced, to the American public's knowledge, effectively no consequences. So my question is straightforward. What happened to the investigative follow-up on those names? The room dropped in temperature. But what came next wasn't the question Bondi expected, and that was exactly the point. Attorney General Bondi, Crockett continued, I received information from a source with direct knowledge of internal DOJ communications. This source alleges that evidence connected to the Epstein client list, specific materials from the Manhattan search, was deliberately not escalated, not because of legal barriers, not because of grand jury protections, but because a decision was made somewhere in this chain of command that certain names on that list would not be pursued. She paused. I need you to tell me under oath whether you have any knowledge of instructions given to you or by you directing how those materials would be handled. 11 seconds of silence. Several reporters stopped typing entirely. I'm not aware of any improper handling of materials, Congresswoman. I didn't say improper. Crockett said immediately. I said deliberate, and I'd asked the committee to note that distinction for the record. Then she looked down at the folder, turned a single page, and continued without looking up. Let me ask you something about the client list specifically. You're an experienced attorney. You understand what it means when investigators have names, have documentation, have individuals connected to a network this significant, and yet only one person from that entire inner circle was ever convicted. 1. His longtime associate, His accountant, who reportedly sought to cooperate for years, was barely engaged until very late in the process. His personal pilot, who logged those flights for over a decade, gave statements that went without meaningful follow-up for an extended period. She raised her eyes. Attorney General Bondi, does that sound like every lead connected to that client list was pursued? No answer. Because here is what Bondi still hadn't addressed. The source who contacted Crockett hadn't just alleged suppression. The source had alleged coordination between DOJ and FBI leadership, and the name that kept appearing in those alleged communications wasn't a career official. It was someone with direct access to both. Bondi responded with a careful 40 seconds about prosecutorial discretion and the complexity of multi-jurisdictional investigations. Every word technically defensible, nothing actually answering the question. Crockett waited. Then she asked the next one. I want to raise something directly. Attorney General, my serious concern, and I want to be honest with you about this, is not simply that mistakes were made. I'm skeptical that someone of your experience and background makes mistakes this consistent without awareness of what those mistakes protect. She leaned forward slightly. You are a trained prosecutor. You know what happens when you don't review primary evidence and rely only on summaries. You know what that creates. So I'll ask you plainly, were you ever made aware, through any channel, formal or informal, that certain individuals connected to the Epstein client list had what might be called protection from escalation within this process? I want to be clear that I take the integrity of, and I want to be clear, Crockett interrupted, that I have serious doubts about your sincerity on that point. Not because I think you're incompetent. The opposite, actually. I think you are fully aware of what you did and did not review. And I think the American people deserve to know whether that awareness came with instructions. Something shifted in Bondi's face then. The composure held. She was too disciplined for it not to. But the effort behind holding it had become visible. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not composed brightness. The muscles along her jaw were working. When she reached for her water glass, her hand moved with the deliberate steadiness of someone actively preventing a tremor. And then quietly, almost imperceptibly, her breath caught in the open microphone. Her eyes went briefly glassy. She blinked it back with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years refusing to let a room see her flinch. Her voice, when it came, carried a slight elevation it had not carried at 9 o'clock. For the first time in the hearing, the weight behind her composure was heavier than the composure itself. Pam Bondi was not going to cry, but she was, in that moment, visibly holding back, something that 40 minutes earlier she had been certain she would never feel in this room. Let me ask you something else, Crockett said, her voice dropping lower now, more deliberate, more dangerous than anything she had said before. There are high-profile individuals connected to the materials recovered from that Manhattan search. Some of them have resources that historically create certain complications for investigators, certain pressures. She looked directly at Bondi. Is it your testimony today that none of those individuals, none of the names on that client list, had any form of informal protection from escalation within DOJ or FBI during the period you've overseen this investigation? Bondi said carefully, I am not aware of any such protection. You're not aware, Crockett repeated. Not that it didn't happen, that you're not aware. Silence. Attorney General Bondi, certain information connected to high-profile figures in this case has already reached the public. In some cases through what appear to have been inadvertent disclosures. And yet, you're telling this committee that the most sensitive materials from a search that federal investigators themselves described as significant, somehow never generated the follow-through that any other investigation of this magnitude would have generated. If the accidental disclosures revealed what they revealed, what exactly do you think the deliberate concealment is protecting? Bondi had no answer, and in that silence, the room understood that the absence of an answer was itself an answer. I'll say this directly, Attorney General Crockett continued. I don't believe you will be in this position much longer. Not because of this hearing alone, but because the administration you serve has shown a consistent pattern of parting ways with officials who become liabilities rather than assets. You told this committee you trust the president's judgment. I'd suggest respectfully that trust may not be reciprocal. When the choice comes between protecting this investigation's credibility and protecting you, I think you already know which one gets protected. She paused. Let that land. You took an oath, Attorney General, a serious one. And I think somewhere in you, you know that the answers you've given today fall short of that oath. Whether that's because you're afraid of what full transparency would expose, or because you received instructions you felt you couldn't refuse, I don't know. But the American people are watching, and they already know more than you seem to think they do. She closed the folder. I sincerely hope you remember that oath before someone else decides to remember it for you. Bondi left the hearing room 12 minutes later. No questions from reporters. Her security detail moved her quickly toward the elevator bank, and the doors closed on a face that had, somewhere in the last 40 minutes, lost the brightness it had carried when she walked in. 3 weeks later, she was removed by the president she had called a friend. Washington had seen faster falls, but few had been predicted so precisely in real time by someone sitting across a table with a closed folder and an audio file she had listened to 3 times before dawn. Crockett never played that recording publicly. She never needed to. Because the most devastating thing about that hearing wasn't what Crockett said. It was what Bondi couldn't. So here is the only question that matters now, and we want your answer in the comments. Was the audio tip Crockett received a genuine warning from someone inside the system who finally couldn't stay silent? Or was it a coordinated pressure campaign designed to remove Bondi from a position she was never fully trusted to hold by people who needed her gone before she said too much? One answer means a whistleblower told the truth about the Epstein client list. The other means someone powerful enough to orchestrate this entire sequence is still in the room. Type your answer. The people making these decisions are counting on your silence. The hearing should have ended there. That was the expectation inside the room. Bondi would leave, reporters would speculate for 24 hours, cable panels would replay the sharpest exchanges, and Washington would move on to the next crisis before the weekend. That was how these moments usually worked. Noise, outrage, headlines, then disappearance. But by 2:13 that afternoon, something unexpected had already begun happening behind closed doors. 3 senior DOJ officials cancelled scheduled appearances without explanation. A communications director, who had spent the morning assuring reporters that Bondi had performed strongly under pressure, suddenly stopped responding to messages entirely. And somewhere inside the FBI headquarters, according to 2 staffers who later spoke anonymously, a meeting that was supposed to focus on budget restructuring turned into something very different after a single phrase was mentioned out loud. Protection from escalation. That phrase spread through Washington faster than the hearing itself. Not because it proved anything conclusively, but because people inside the system understood exactly what Crockett had been implying. She had not accused Bondi of incompetence. That would have been politically ordinary. She had accused her of awareness, of seeing enough to know what questions were never supposed to be asked. And in Washington, there is nothing more dangerous than suggesting a cover-up may not have been chaotic at all, but organised. By sunset, reporters were no longer focused on the hearing exchange itself. They were focused on what happened immediately after it ended. Bondi had skipped a scheduled internal briefing. Her deputy attended instead. A planned media appearance on a national network was quietly cancelled less than an hour before airtime. Officially, it was described as a scheduling conflict. Unofficially, staffers began whispering that someone close to Bondi had advised her to stop speaking publicly until the situation stabilised. But the situation was not stabilising, because late that night, a second detail emerged, one that never appeared in the official hearing transcript. According to a committee aide seated 3 chairs behind Crockett, Bondi had written something on a legal pad immediately after the phrase, "Instructions you felt you couldn't refuse." Just 5 words. The aide claimed Bondi underlined them twice before sliding the pad face down beside her folder. Who gave her that recording? No one knows whether the account was true. The committee never confirmed it. But inside Washington, the story detonated instantly because it suggested something even more explosive than suppression. Fear. Not fear of the public, not fear of the press. Fear that someone inside the system had broken ranks. And once that possibility entered the conversation, people started revisiting old details that previously seemed insignificant. Why had certain Epstein-related records reportedly changed classification status multiple times? Why had investigative timelines repeatedly stalled after appearing close to expansion? Why had prosecutors in different jurisdictions quietly complained for years about limited access to materials connected to the broader network? None of these questions had clear public answers. But after Crockett's confrontation, they no longer sounded like isolated bureaucratic failures. They sounded connected. The next morning, the atmosphere inside several federal offices reportedly became tense enough that senior staff began restricting internal document access. Phones that normally stayed on desks were carried into hallways before conversations happened. One congressional staffer later described it this way. It felt less like damage control and more like people trying to figure out who else knew. And then came the detail that changed everything again. At 8:41 a.m., less than 24 hours after the hearing, a long-time investigative journalist received an encrypted message from an anonymous account containing only one sentence. Look at the visitor logs from July. No attachment, no explanation. But that sentence triggered a frenzy among reporters already digging into Epstein-related contacts and timelines. Because July was not random. July was the month when multiple agencies had reportedly coordinated around the handling of sensitive materials connected to the Manhattan residence search. If someone wanted investigators looking specifically at visitor records during that period, it implied meetings had occurred that were never supposed to attract attention. Suddenly, every unanswered question from the hearing felt larger. Who exactly had access to those materials after the Manhattan search? Who decided which leads received priority? And why did so many experienced investigators seem willing to avoid discussing certain names publicly, even years later? The pressure around Bondi intensified by the hour. Inside conservative political circles, allies who had defended her aggressively just days earlier began changing their tone, not openly, not dramatically, but enough for experienced Washington observers to notice. Statements became shorter, defenses became conditional. Phrases like, "we need all the facts," quietly replaced phrases like, "complete confidence." That shift mattered because political survival in Washington often depends less on public attacks than on private silence. And Bondi was beginning to experience the kind of silence that signals isolation. Then another moment, almost invisible to the public, made insiders even more nervous. 3 days after the hearing, Crockett appeared briefly outside the Capitol and was asked by a reporter whether she intended to release additional evidence connected to her claims. She paused for 2 seconds before answering. "I think certain people are already aware of what exists." That was it, no elaboration, no specifics. But the reaction inside Washington was immediate, because seasoned officials recognized the language. It sounded less like a threat to the public and more like a warning directed privately at someone behind the scenes. And according to multiple staffers, that was the moment panic truly started spreading. Because if Crockett possessed more than the audio clip, if she had documents, communications, names, or internal correspondence, then the hearing had not been the climax. It had been the opening move. By the end of the week, the administration faced a growing internal problem. Bondi's continued presence was no longer simply controversial. It was becoming destabilizing. Every appearance she made generated new questions. Every refusal to answer created another news cycle. And perhaps most dangerously, every denial now sounded carefully constructed instead of confident. One White House aide reportedly described the situation bluntly during a private conversation leaked weeks later. The issue wasn't whether she knew. The issue was whether people believed she knew. And in politics, perception often destroys careers faster than proof. The final fracture reportedly happened during a closed-door strategy session attended by senior administration figures. Details remain disputed, but several accounts agree on one point. Bondi was asked directly whether there were any undisclosed vulnerabilities still connected to the Epstein materials that could become public later. Her response has never been officially revealed. But 2 people familiar with the meeting later claimed the room went quiet, afterward in a way they described as deeply uncomfortable. 12 days later, discussions about replacing her had reportedly already begun. And through all of it, Crockett remained unusually calm. No triumphant interviews, no dramatic pee.